I am way too agreeable. What steps can I take to integrate my shadow and stop being a doormat? All my life, I've had so much anger, but I don't know towards what or how to get rid of it. I've been through a few different types of therapy, and it's a bit better, but still takes me over from time to time. What advice do you have for me? I don't think that there's a better pathway to the shadow, let's say, than resentment. If you're feeling resentful about something, there's a shadow that reveals itself in two ways. One is, it's a pointer to your immaturity. You need to be more disciplined. You have set goals, hypothetically, and if you haven't, then you're under the sway of someone else, or you're undisciplined and unintegrated and incoherent, which is all shadow life in some sense. You're pursuing short-term impulsive goals because you haven't thought it through. You're pursuing goals that other people have established for you. You're not pursuing any goals at all because you're too nihilistic to believe that life has any purpose. All that's shadowy, let's say. But maybe you have set goals and now you're resentful about all the work that you have to do in order to acquire those goals, and maybe that manifests itself as a broad-scale critique of social structure. That's immaturity, and so you can delve into that and you can find out where you're still a spoiled child and hopefully take action to rectify that. Or you may find that you're being compelled to do something that violates your integrity, and you need to stand up for yourself and say something that you don't want to say. And then you may have to learn how to incorporate your anger into your actions so that you learn how to say no when you need to say no. And so that actually means that you're furthering your ethical pursuit as a consequence of integrating your shadow rather than deviating from it. Aggression, which can be repressed, sexuality, lust, let's say, which can be repressed. Those things are extremely useful servants when they're integrated into the whole. If you're without aggression and anger and incapable of it, that doesn't mean that you're on a good path and that anger knocks you off it. That can happen, but it's much more appropriate and sophisticated to note that the probability that you're going to pursue a higher good is magnified by your integration of all your emotional and motivational states, even the ones that can cause a tremendous amount of trouble when they're left to manifest themselves in isolation. You're way too agreeable. Well, I would say you could practice saying what you really believe, that you can take a vow to tell the truth. And that will make you much less agreeable. Agreeable people are perfectly willing to sacrifice what they know to be the case to maintain short-term social harmony. And it's not so much that they repress what they think, it's often that they don't even allow themselves to fully realize what they think. So commitment to the truth can make an agreeable person, will stop an agreeable person from being a doormat. I mean, if you're in a relationship and the person is irritating you with something they've done, you might be highly motivated not to say anything about it because you want to keep the peace. You don't want to upset them. You don't want the conflict. That's all characteristic of high agreeableness. But once you decide to tell the truth, then if you're annoyed, you don't get to hide it. You don't get to assume you're right. You don't get to grab the person by the shirt collar and say, look, I'm annoyed and you're wrong. You get to say, I'm irritated about this situation and I need to think through that irritation to find out if I have a problem or if you have a problem, or if we both have a problem, or if it's a different problem altogether. But you can't hide the fact that the problem has made itself manifest. And so if you're agreeable, and you tell the truth about your emotional state, that will propel you out of that agreeableness by necessity. So, with regards to anger, I don't know towards what or how to get rid of it. Well, something a cognitive behavioral therapist might recommend is for a week, and maybe this is already a therapy you've been through, but this exercise is generally quite useful. First, you have to note when you're angry and admit to that, and maybe you have to practice that. So you have to decide, I'm going to pay attention, I'm going to see when I'm angry, and I'm going to admit to it, at least to begin with, without judgment. I'm just going to observe it. I'm going to allow myself to observe it. Then you have to allow yourself to see what angry thoughts you have. And you can ask yourself that. What angry thoughts do I frequently have? They'll likely come to mind, maybe many of them. You can jot all those down. Those are ones you're familiar with. And then you can notice when you're angry, and you can ask yourself, well, what am I thinking right at this moment? What angry thoughts am I thinking? And some of them might be quite shocking. It might also manifest themselves in destructive fantasies. You know, maybe you have a fantasy of grabbing somebody by a shirt collar and pushing them up against a wall, or dumping, hot coffee on your boss, or some impulse towards aggression that might manifest itself as a flashing fantasy. And perhaps one that you're shocked by and don't want to admit. You don't want to admit to the existence of it, but you need to see what's happening first in your own imagination if you're going to cope with it. It's also possible that a fair bit of the anger that you have is actually useful if you could just find out what it is and what it's directed toward. So the first tack is to explore the anger. What gives rise to it? What situations give rise to it? What people give rise to it? What are you doing when it happens? And what is the phenomenology of the anger? How does it make itself manifest in image, fantasy, and thought? And then now you have an anger inventory. Is anger in this situation warranted? What steps do I have to take in order to become less angry? And sometimes that might be an adjustment of an internal psychological adjustment. Sometimes it might require changes in the world. Maybe you're in a relationship that's oppressive, and you have been for a long time. And the way to fix that isn't to adjust your attitude, although it could be, but it might be that it's time to get out of the relationship. And so, differentiation. When are you angry? What elicits it? Why are you angry? Who are you angry at? What are the nature of the angry thoughts? What are the nature of the angry fantasies? All of that. You have to get that out where you can see it. Then you have to walk through it. And you can do that by yourself. You can do that while writing. You can produce counter thoughts. So if you're angry about something, you could outline the reasons why anger is not productive, or you could outline the reasons why it's productive and the reasons it's not productive for a full exploration of the issue. Then I would ask you too, if you're angry all the time, is, well, are you depressed? Have you been evaluated clinically? If this is a major problem, is it a manifestation of depression? Because anger is an underdiagnosed symptom of depression. Do you have well thought through goals and plans and strategies? All of that. That's a more comprehensive evaluation of your entire life. And maybe you have something to say or do that you're not saying or doing. It's highly probable. Most of us have that problem. The right level of focus is the individual. And what individuals can do first is like what a physician should do. First, do no harm, right? Like assume that, you're probably a force for mayhem and trouble unless you've got yourself disciplined and aimed.
Right.
Because you're complicated and troublesome. And so unless you've got your act together, you're trouble. And everyone knows that. And they know people like that. So the first thing you do is constrain the amount of damage you're likely to do. And you do that by disciplining yourself and by also admitting to yourself that you don't know what you're doing, that there's lots of things about you that need to be improved, which is actually, that's a beacon of hope, right? It's like, well, my life is miserable. Yeah, but you're doing a bunch of things wrong. It's like, oh, good, because if I'm doing a bunch of things wrong, then maybe if I fix them, my life won't be so horrible. Well, that's good. And everyone knows about the fact that they're not doing things right, fundamentally. You know, they don't have to examine their conscience that much to figure that out. And then you can start aiming for something good. Start not lying any more than you have to, or maybe not at all if you can train yourself. Then you start to discern truth from falsehood. And then you can find out empirically, does your life get better or worse? Well, you know, I've got hundreds of letters now, maybe thousands of letters from people who have been trying that, you know, and they say, well, you know, I'm way better. I'm doing way better than, you know, than I thought that I was before. I went into a restaurant the other day in Toronto, and this kid came up and he shook my hand and he said, I just want you to know that since I've been listening to you, I've got 3 promotions at this restaurant. And I said, well, you know, good work, man, like, way to be. And he said, yeah, well, I started coming in on time and I'm working really hard and I'm trying to figure out how I can do a good job here instead of being above the job, you know. I'll take this until I get something better. It's sort of beneath me. It's like, no, probably not. Actually, it's not that easy to do most jobs. It's actually hard to do most jobs, especially to do them well. And it turns out that the world is constituted, if society is set up well, that if you do a good job, invisible doors open in front of you. Because people, and I know this, I've had lots of contact with businesses and academic institutions, and like the people who run things competently are often, but not always, very interested in finding young people that they can mentor and move forward. It's actually one of the pleasures of being competent in something.
Yeah.
And so if they see someone who's like going that extra mile, you know, busy people have lots of opportunities around them. And they think, oh, I've got that opportunity. I can't really do it, but I can funnel it over to this kid here.
Yeah.
Like, let's see how he or she does it. You know, and so you say, yeah, you want to try this? And the person says, well, I don't have time. It's like, well, okay. But the smart kid says, yeah, yes, I'll do that. And then the person with opportunities watches and thinks, okay, well, let's, you know, we'll back up a bit, see if the person does it. And if they do it, it's like, hey, here's 4 more opportunities that I don't have time for. The system is rigged against you, okay? You're gonna die. You're gonna be ill. Like, it's rough, man. Now, you don't want to lay that at the feet of the social structure, because the social structure, at least in part, is trying to have you not die, right? I mean, that's why we have walls and electricity and all of that. It works pretty damn well. You know, you're probably going to live till you're 80. And the only reason you're not going to live longer is because we can't figure out how to get you to live longer. That's why. You're not going to starve to death. Wild animals aren't going to tear you in pieces. Tyrants aren't going to rip you from limb to limb. It's like, these are good things. Now, you still got a big problem because the cosmic system is rigged against you in a sense. But, okay, so fine.
What do you mean by that, the cosmic system?
Well, you know, you're vulnerable and you can be broken, and you will be in many ways. But you can't blame someone for that. It's just, that's the structure of reality. Okay, so what do you do about that? Well, as far as I can tell, and I've always looked as a psychologist for optimistic ideas. And I'm not an easy sell with regards to optimistic ideas, especially because of my basic belief in the idea that, you know, the most profound truth is that life is suffering. It's okay, fine, life is suffering. You can't blame that on anyone. All right, so what do you do about it? Well, maybe nothing. Maybe nothing. Maybe the jig's up, it's hopeless, you know? But maybe that's not right. Maybe here's something. What you have against the suffering and the malevolence, let's say, you have possibility, you have potential in front of you, inside of you even, whatever that means. So here's the question. What would your life be like if you made use of all the potential that you were offered? That's the optimistic question, because you can test it out. Say, okay, well, I'll just try that for a year. I'm gonna do the best I can at everything that offers itself to me, just as an experiment. And then I'm gonna see, well, is my life better or is my life worse? It's like, you
try it for a year. You think, it's actually better. My friendships are better. My family's better. I'm less anxious. I'm more positively oriented. I'm less resentful and bitter and jealous and angry. I'm more physically healthy. It's like, hey, great. And you're not that good at it. It's like, what happens if you did that for 5 years?
Yeah, that's a good addiction.
That's an addiction. Yeah, it's an addiction to possibility. And then it's also an exponential thing. And this is actually technically true. We know this beyond a shadow of a doubt. There's this principle that economists talk about. They often call it the Matthew principle, which is based on a statement in the New Testament. From those who have everything, to those who have everything, more will be given. And from those who have nothing, everything will be taken. It's really a vicious statement. But what it means is, as you go downhill faster and faster. And people know that. It's like, it isn't linear, man. It's exponential. You do one thing, stupid, then 2 stupid things happen, then 4 stupid things happen. And, before you know it, you're done. But the reverse of that is also true. You do one good thing and then, you get 2 opportunities and you fix them up and you get 4. And this is how the world works. It's a fundamental economic principle. And you see, because of that a small proportion of people have most of the gains accrue to them. And they're the ones, they're healthy. That's luck often, They didn't get run over by a bus. Like, there's lots of arbitrary things about life that have to go right. But after that, it's like, those are also people who are capitalizing on what they're being offered without bitterness or resentment. And then maybe it won't work for you, but you don't have a better plan than that. So there's a rule for working with old people in old age homes, and the rule is, don't do anything for the residents that they can do themselves. You think, well, that's pretty harsh. It's like, no, it isn't. You're helping them retain their independence and their strength, right?
Yeah.
So you're not stealing their strength. And it's the same with little kids. Like, little kids should be doing whatever they can that's productive and useful as young as they can. People talk a lot about self-esteem, which is it's very badly conceptualized self-esteem, because it's come to mean you should feel good about yourself, which I don't believe. I think you should feel good about who you could be if you got your act together. And you shouldn't be feeling so good about who you are now in your sorry state. It's like, what the hell, man? You're 17. Don't be feeling too good about yourself. Get your act together and see what you could be and feel good about your trajectory.
Yeah.
That's way different, but also your competence. And so, like, even with little kids, they know they're being taken care of. They have an existential debt to their parents. It's like, if you allow them to be useful and encourage them to do things, then they get to pay off that existential debt. And then they can see that they're contributing members of even this small society. And it's no lie. One of the studies was a study of motivation, technical study of motivation in rats. Let's say you want to motivate a rat. Okay, so first of all, you make them hungry, and they'll work for food. So then maybe you have him learn this maze. He has to run the maze to get the food reward. And so he runs it a few times. He knows there's food there. So you put him at the beginning of the maze and you let him go. And then you watch how fast he goes to the maze. Now, there's a couple of ways you can measure his motivation. You can attach him to a spring and have him pull against the spring. And then, you get some estimate of how much work he's willing to put in to go down the maze. Or you can time him. Okay, so now imagine you got your hungry rat and you let him go at the beginning of the maze, and he zooms up to get the food, and he's, moving at like 10 miles an hour. But now you do something different. You put him in the same place, but as well as him being hungry and going after the food, you waft in a little bit of cat odor.
Danger.
Now, yeah, rats hate cats. They can't stand them. Even if they've never met a cat, they can't tolerate the odor. It really terrifies them. And so that rat will run towards that food much faster than he will if he's just hungry. And so, like, if you want to run towards something that you want, it's really useful to be running away from something you truly don't want.
Yeah.
And I thought about, so that's part of the reason we built that into the system. And I had a metaphysical take on that too, which is, like many religious systems have a kind of notion of something like hell that's very well developed in Christianity. And so hell is where you end up when you lie. That's one way of thinking about it, in a very good way. You might think, well, is there any psychological utility in that idea? And the answer is, yeah. You need to know where you could end up if things went wrong, because then you're motivated by fear to move forward. If you're not motivated by fear to move forward, then your fear's in front of you stopping you, because you might think, oh my God, I can't take the risks necessary to attain these goals. What if something goes wrong? Well, it's like, yeah, well then you're frozen. But if you think, no, wait a second, there's risks to proceeding, but nothing compared to the risks of failing. So then the fear is behind you, pushing you forward. That's so you need a vision of hell. It's like, okay, what's your personal vision of hell? You let your life fall apart because of your own stupidity and your own blindness. It's like you're the worst place you could be in 5 years. Well, that's what we ask people to write about. Arithmetic helps too.
In which sense?
Well, this is something I've done with big groups of students and my clients as well. It's like, okay, I ask students in particular between the ages of, say, 18 and 20. It's like, well, how much time do you waste in a day? Is it an hour? And people say no. Is it like 4 hours? No. 10? No. It's usually about 6. I can get a group of 200 students to agree that they're just wasting 6 hours a day. No, and by their own definition of wasting, right? So, okay, so then we do some mathematics with that. We've got the 6, that's fine, 6 hours a day. Okay, so that's 40 hours a week. All right, so then I think, well, what's your time worth? And they think, well, minimum wage, because most of the students, if they went out to work, they'd only get minimum wage. But that's not right, because that's a discounted version. Their time is worth way more than that if they're working on something useful, because it's an investment. So it's perfectly reasonable to assume that if you're a reasonably bright student, your time is worth $25 an hour, something like that, because of its potential for future payoff. It's okay. Well, that's $1,000 a week. Right, so it's $4,000 a month, it's $50,000 a year. In 4 years, it's $200,000. So that's what wasting your day is costing you. It's like, let's make no mistake about it. You're going to be $200,000 poorer in 4 years because you're wasting your time. Is that really what you want to do? You're rich enough so that you're willing to forego that $200,000. Well, no one's ever sat them down and said, look, put an estimate out of the value of your time. Figure out how much of it you're wasting, and then ask yourself if you really think that that's a good idea. Because it's actually not a good idea. And I don't think anybody thinks it's a good idea.
Yeah, damn straight. I think it ties into if it gets measured, it gets managed.
Yeah.
The moment you start putting stuff down in numbers, that does something to our brain.
Yeah. Well, it's part of the goal setting issue. It's like you calibrate things and make them precise. You can no longer hide from it. And the funny thing too is that, because I also ask the classes the same thing. Well, do you enjoy yourself while you're wasting that time? And the answer is always no. People feel terrible. It's like, they're watching one YouTube video after another that they're not even interested in, or they're watching like endless amounts of pornography or some damn thing, or they're playing video games, not because they want to, but because they can't stop, and they know they should be doing something else. It's not enjoyable time. So not only is it and that's part of why it's wasted. It's like, it's not productive and it's not enjoyable. Well,
so how much of that procrastination is, because setting goals is a great counter to that, so how much of that behavior, if you look at it, because it's not rational behavior, is also sort of kind of same like goal setting, wired into us because of our evolutionary path? I've always wondered about procrastination in myself, like why am I like that every now and then?
That's a good question. Well, look, procrastination needs no explanation. The answer to should you do something difficult and energy intensive is no, because it's difficult and it's energy intensive, right? So there actually has to be your default position can easily be, no, I'm not going to do that difficult and intensive thing. There should be some internal resistance to doing that because it's costly. Okay, well, but then you think, well, wait a second, there are conditions under which investing in something intensive and energy demanding is appropriate. Well, yeah, but you got to specify the conditions. Like, why should you listen to yourself? You can think about it this way. Why should you listen to yourself if you're an idiot? You know what I mean? If you don't have a plan your body's thinking, no, I'm just going to sit here and take it easy because who knows when the next antelope is going to come along so I can kill it. I'm just going to lie here like a lion and wait.
Yeah.
It's like, no, you need a reason that that's a bad idea.
And I think a track record, like the goals and the reasons and and that you've already chased after a few antelopes, for example, and you've actually managed to do it. So you know you can.
Well, there's that too. You know, because your deeper self might be saying, well, you want me to get up and do something. What makes you think I can trust you? You know, you're not just running down some blind alley. Well, if you've had some victories, you can say, no, we're serious about this. Mm-hmm. And so, and the goal setting too, like I would think about it more like, it's more like the development of a vision. It's a better way of thinking about it, I think. Because goals, it's a bit narrow in a sense. The idea is that you can have a vision of the future and a counter vision. And that you, not only can you have it, you need that. It's, without that, you won't move forward against your procrastination.
How do you remain focused and productive in the face of insurmountable work?
Lists, schedules, and I have help. I mean, my wife in particular in the last year has been unbelievably helpful. I mean, it's become a full-time job for her, really, helping me manage my schedule and keep me on track. But a lot of it is, like, I get up in the morning, I have, like, everything scheduled. I know exactly what I'm supposed to do. There's a hierarchy of priority, and I'm really operating on a day-to-day level right now because there's so many things to do. I can't look more than about a day or two ahead, although it's basically scheduled. You know, but I learned to discipline myself when I was in graduate school. When I was writing, I wrote a book called Maps of Meaning that was published in 1999, and I worked on that for about 15 years, about 3 hours a day. And I really sort of grabbed myself by the scruff of the neck and like forced myself to learn how to concentrate without deviation.
What tips would you give a highly emotional person to become more rational and level-headed?
Oh, well, it depends. There's a variety of... The first thing I would do if you're highly emotional, volatile, fly off the handle, a lot of mood variation, a lot of negative emotion, the first thing you might want to think about is whether or not there's actually something wrong with you, like physically. You might be ill, because illness can do that to people, and so you should go get yourself checked out. You know, you might have an inflammatory condition or something like that. And the next thing I would check out is like, are you sure you're not hungry? I'm dead serious about this. I mean, with many of my clients who've been anxious, like a lot of them, they come in and say, I'm so anxious. I had this one client, she'd come in and she'd say, God, you know, I'm so dead at the end of the day. I'm just wiped out. I've got no energy at all. All I can do is lay down. She was like 24. All I can do is lay down and watch like the same movie I watched the night before. Is that normal? I was like, well, no, it's not. So, and I knew this. I said, well, what do you eat? And she said, well, I usually don't have any breakfast. And then I have like a little bowl of rice for lunch. And I usually have something like that for dinner. And I thought, you live on 2 balls of rice a day, and you're wondering why, when you come home at night after a full day's work, you don't have any energy. I said, well, have you considered the possibility that you're starving to death? So, you know, we talked about this. I said, you can't live like that. That's not going to work. How about let's try this for a week? You do this with therapy, and you do experiments if you're a behavioral therapist. It's like, you got to come to an agreement with the person. It's like, look, is there some other things you'd eat other than rice? You know, like 4 other things. It's like, we agreed. Maybe she'd eat an egg or something. It's like, or I think it was eggs. And I don't remember what it was. There was a few other things. I said, okay, look, here's what you do. Get up in the morning and like have 2 eggs. You don't have to enjoy them. You know, because people say, well, I'm not hungry. It's like, why is that relevant? That's not the issue here. It isn't like gourmet time. It's not starving to death time. So eat your 2 eggs and maybe in 3 months you'll enjoy it. You know, until then it'll be like chewing down rubbery cardboard, but it's not that big a deal. So, we upped her caloric intake by a factor of about 4, and she came back, and it was like, I think she came back 2 more times. It's like, oh, I have lots of energy now. It's like, oh, good, you're not dying of starvation. If you're a volatile person, try this. Eat a high-protein, high-fat meal in the morning. No sugar. And a big one. Like have a steak. Have something solid. And doesn't matter if you like it. Who cares? Cook it the night before if you don't want to cook it then. Just try it for a week and see what happens. My suspicions, I've had half my clients, I would say, have dropped their volatility levels 50% by eating a high-fat, high-protein breakfast. And then also notice that if you are crabby, and volatile and touchy and you can't get along with anyone, go eat something. Like have 2 teaspoons of peanut butter and wait 10 minutes and see if you're still a witch. So for some people, and if you are a volatile person, like your blood sugar levels tend to move up and down more because you stress yourself out more. For some people, that really matters. And so, look, try it for a week. It's nothing, right? And you might think, oh, God, what you'll find, if it works, is, A, you don't get nearly as upset about the things that used to upset you. And that'll be a shock. You'll think, oh my God, I would have flown off the handle because of that before, and now it's hardly bothering me. So that's a lovely thing. And then the second thing is, if something bothers you, you'll recover way faster. And so that's a good start. And so try that. That's no harm. It's not going to hurt you. Try getting up at the same time every day. That's really important. If your sleep-wake cycle is not regular, and you're a volatile person, say biochemically, genetically, having a sleep-wake cycle that's dysregulated is going to be very hard on you. So it doesn't matter quite as much when you go to bed, although it would be good to regularize that too, but at least pick a time. You can pick whatever time you want. Like I would recommend like 8 o'clock or 7:30, because that's what normal people do. And unless you have a really good reason not to be a normal person, you should start by trying to be a normal person if you're being an abnormal person. So try to get up at the same time and try that. You can combine that with eating and see, like my suspicions are 50% improvement virtually immediately with that. And then if that doesn't work, well, then there are more serious things that you can consider. Being checked out by an MD and making sure you're okay. You might want to go talk to a therapist. Having dysregulated negative emotion is no picnic, man, and it's really hard on the people around you as well. So those are that, and I have this program online I mentioned. The other thing you could try is go online. I have this program called Future Authoring. You could do the past authoring program and bring yourself up to date, but Future Authoring is a program that helps you make a plan for your life. And what do you want from your friends, your family, your career, your education? How are you going to take care of yourself mentally and physically? Where would you like to be in 3 to 5 years? How are you going to regulate temptation, drug and alcohol use, and that sort of thing? Keep yourself out of trouble. And how are you going to stop yourself from deteriorating to where you could deteriorate if you weren't careful? You can do a credible job of the program in an hour and a half. It's proved very useful for people. Maybe you're kind of aimless and you need a plan. That's another possibility. But don't live with it. There's lots of things you can try. Sleep, that might be number 1. Food, that's number 2. Number 3, talk to someone, a professional, if it's really out of hand, because what do you want to do? You want to suffer terribly for the next 10 years? And plus, if you do have a lot of excess negative emotion, it's really hard on you psychophysiologically because you produce a lot of stress hormones, and that makes you old. So it's dangerous physically as well. And it's hard on your brain. So if you can get it fixed, fix it. What your eating habits are like or your sleeping habits, but if you are an anxious person and that's manifesting itself in, say, neurotic overanalysis, there's 2 things you can do very rapidly, 3 things really, that will help quell that. 4 things even. Number 1, get up at the same time every day, and I would recommend in the morning because that's when people generally get up, and it's good to do what everyone else does unless you have a good reason not to. Number 2, eat a large breakfast, right? keep it carbohydrate light. You know, don't eat toast and and Fruit Loops. That's not going to do the trick. Make it fat and protein heavy, and eat more than you want. You might say, I'm not hungry in the morning. It's like, this has nothing to do with what you want or what your appetite is. It's like, you need to eat in the morning. If you're an anxious person and you don't eat in the morning and then you stress yourself out, your body hyperproduces insulin. It takes all the blood sugar out of your blood, and that dysregulates your metabolism for the entire day. You can't reset it till you go to sleep at night. And I've had lots of anxious clients who would say fall into the overanalytic category, who were like virtually cured by eating a large breakfast every morning. I would highly recommend that. You could try some physical exercise. Weightlifting is really good for curing anxiety. Another thing you can do, as I alluded to earlier today, is to make a schedule and start attending to your daily micro routines. So, you know, you got to figure out what your overanalysis is. It might be cognitive, like maybe you have a very active mind, you know, you're fast verbally. Are you fast verbally? One way you can find that out is to do something like write down as many words as you can that begin with the letter S, for example, in 3 minutes. Do that with a bunch of your friends, and if you're someone who writes down way more words than anyone else, then you're verbally fluent, and that might be driving some of your overanalysis. But my guess is that you're suffering from some rumination that's related to anxiety, and so I told you what I think the simplest ways are to rectify that. All right, you got 3 years, man. You're going to live them anyways. Devote those 3 years to setting the world up around you so that it's the best it could possibly be for you. As if you were taking care of yourself, as if you cared for yourself. Well, what would that look like? You know, let's say, just for the sake of argument, if you figured out where you were, that you could have what would be best for you. Well, what is that? I bet you never asked. People don't ask. And so life comes at them like random snakes, and they sort of fend them off, and life goes by and things don't work out the way people expected them to. But a huge part of that is they didn't know where they were because they wouldn't look, or didn't know that they should look. Ignorance and willful blindness, right? 2 great catastrophes. And they never figured out where they wanted to go or why. Now, there's a problem with figuring out where you want to go. And the problem is that you make your conditions for failure clear to yourself. And people don't like that. So if you keep yourself in the fog, then you can't tell when you screwed up. Now that isn't so good because you're still screwing up. You're just too blind, self-blind to notice. Although in the short term, that's less painful. If you make your criteria for success razor sharp, then you know every time you screw up. But that's great because then you could fix it. You could either repair the behavioral inadequacy or the conceptual inadequacy that you're using as a tool in that situation, or maybe you could adjust your damn plan. Either way, you can fix it. And so, okay, so you're living in one of these bloody things, and you might as well, it seems to me, you might as well make it the best one you could live in because you don't have anything better to do. Now, if you don't do that, if you don't do it consciously, and this is what the psychoanalysts pointed out, is that you have innumerable quasi-autonomous subsystems that make you up that will generate stories impulsively, and you'll just act them out. And you know that because you watch yourself over 2 weeks and you think, Jesus, I did a lot of stupid things in the last 2 weeks. And you think, why? And it's because you're a collection of somewhat random quasi-autonomous personality units, and lacking a leader, they're just going to fire off whenever they want, you know. First you're hungry, then you're thirsty, then you want to go to bed with your wife, you know. Then you want to sleep in, then you want to tell your boss off, then you want to curse at the guy that cuts you off in traffic. It's like, you're kind of like a 2-year-old, you know, just it's one emotional frame after another vying for dominance. There's no overarching hierarchy, and there's no king at the top. I've been telling people online in various ways and in lectures that they should start fixing up the world by cleaning up their room. And I wanted to just elaborate on that a little bit before I get back to the lecture itself. So, as it's become this weird internet meme, you know, and And it's a joke, and good, it's a joke. I'm really happy about the fact that so much of this has got like the leaven of humor in it. It's really important, because that's what stops things from degenerating into conflict, humor. And I was thinking about this idea of cleaning up your room in relationship to the mustard seed idea. And you see, the thing about cleaning up your room, this is also something I learned from Carl Jung and his studies on alchemy, because for Jung, when the alchemist was attempting to make the philosopher's stone, he was not only engaged in the transformation of the material world, but he was engaged in a process of self-transformation that occurred at the same time as the chemical transformation. So it was a psychological work in some sense. Let's say you want to sort out your room and beautify it, because the beauty is also important. And let's say that all you have is just a little room, like you're not rich, you're poor. And you don't have any power, that's another thing. But you've got your damn room, and you've got this space right in front of you, that's a part of the cosmos that you can come to grips with. And you might think, well, what's there in front of you, right in front of you? And the answer to that is, it depends on how open your eyes are. That's the proper answer, because you could say, and William Blake said this, for example, and Aldous Huxley made comments that were very similar, that in a transcendent state you can see infinity in the finite. And you might say, well, you can see infinity in what you have within your grasp if you look, and you could say maybe that's the case with your room. And so you want to clean up your room. Well, okay, how do you do that exactly? Well, a room is a place to sleep. And so if you set your room up properly, then you figure out how to sleep and when you should sleep and how you should sleep. And then you figure out when you should wake up. And then you figure out, well, what clothes you should wear, because they have to be arranged properly in your dresser. And then you have to have some place to put your clothes. And if you're going to have some clothes, you have to figure out what you're going to wear those clothes to do, right? And then that means you have to figure out what you're going to do. And then your room has to serve that purpose, because otherwise it isn't set up properly. And if it doesn't serve your purposes, you will be unhappy and not happy in the room, because the way that we perceive the world is as a place to move from point A to point B in. And then if the place that we're in facilitates that movement, then we're happy to be there. And if the place that we're in serves as an obstacle to that movement, then we're unhappy to be there. And so what it means to set up your room is that you have to have somewhere to go that's worthwhile, or you can't set up your room, and then your room has to be set up to facilitate that. And then the next thing is, well, maybe you have to make it beautiful. But that's not easy, right? That means you have to have some taste. And that doesn't mean you have to have money. It doesn't, because you can be garish with money, and you can be tasteful with nothing. All you need is taste, and taste beats money when it comes to beautifying things. Not that money is trivial, because it's not, but taste is crucial. And people who are very artistically oriented can make beautiful things out of virtually nothing. And not only that, the literature suggests that if you're going to make beautiful things, putting real constraints on what you allow yourself to do facilitates creativity instead of interfering with it. Because let's say you have to make something out of nothing, right? Which I suppose would be a godly act, right? You have to make something out of nothing. You have to be creative in order to do that. And so then to beautify your room means that you also have to develop your capacity to be creative. And so then you can make your room shine. But then what will happen is that if your family isn't together, they will interfere with that. You'll interfere with that, because you won't have the discipline to do it properly. But then when you start building this little microcosm of perfection with what you have at hand, then it'll evoke all the pathologies of everyone in your household. They'll wonder what the hell you're up to in there. And they won't necessarily be happy, because if they're in a lowly place, let's say, and so are you, and you're trying to move out of that, then the higher you move out of that, the more the place they're in looks bad. And you might say, well, what they should do is celebrate your victory over chaos and evil, but that isn't what will happen. What will happen instead is that they will attempt to pull you back down. They'll attempt to, and I mean, obviously all families don't do that, but all families do that to some degree, and some families do almost nothing but that. And so what that means is that if you're going to organize your room, then you're going to have to confront the devils in your house, and that's often a terrifying thing, because some of those devils have lineages that go back many, many, many generations, and God only knows what you have to struggle with in order to overcome that. And so to sort yourself out and to fix up your room is a non-trivial matter, and you can do that. You'll learn by doing that, and then maybe you'll learn enough by doing that so that you can fix up your family a little bit, and then having done that, you'll have enough character so that when you try to operate in the world at your job or maybe in the broader social spheres, that you'll be a force for good instead of harm, because you'll have learned some humility by noting just how difficult it was to put your damn room together, well, and yourself for that matter. And so you'll proceed cautiously with your eyes open towards the good. Do you plan your day much, or your time generally? Does this lead to higher productivity? Yes, I plan my day obsessively. My calendar is always absolutely full, and often weeks in advance. And I plan in the morning, especially when I'm on top of things. And I plan each hour, and I probably plan each minute. And yes, it leads to way higher productivity. You know, you decide what your goals are going to be. You place them in the calendar. Use the calendar as your friend, eh? Because what you want to do with the calendar is design a day that you want to have, or a day that would be good for you. And a day that would be good for you is one that you're you know, when you end the day, you feel that you've moved yourself ahead towards your valued goals, and that you've kept chaos under control. And that enables you to sleep soundly and with a good conscience, and to know that the next day is going to be at least not worse than that day. Planning is unbelievably useful. And again, you know, I don't want to sound like a broken record with regards to the future authoring program, but it really is useful. You know, you need to figure out what it is that you're aiming at and why, and then you need to figure out how you're going to break that down over the months and the weeks and the days. But I would approach your calendar like it's your best friend. You think, okay, I'm going to design a week, man, that I really want to have. And that means you can schedule in leisure and all the things that you want to do, which you absolutely should do. And it's also quite fun to give yourself minimal time to do something complicated, because it's quite challenging to see if you can do far more than you thought in far less time. I'm 40, but I feel like a child, watching everyone around me get older and die. So I'm homesick for the past instead of accepting the terrifying present. How can I stop mourning the past? Well, I grouped the last 3 questions together, including this one, because they all allowed me to talk reasonably about these programs. The self-authoring program has a past authoring component that helps people write out an autobiography. Now, you're suffering from what Freud described as reminiscences of the past. You're possessed by reminiscences. They won't get out of your mind. And what that means to me is, well, it's one of 2 things. One is that there's things in your past that you need to understand more deeply, and that's why they're still calling to you. And there are things in your past that you had, perhaps, that you need to have in the present and the future. And so you could do the past authoring program and write out your past. It asks you to detail the most emotionally significant events that occurred during different epochs or stages of your life. So you have to break your life into a number of stages. I think we recommended 6, but you can break it into as many as you want or as few. And then to detail out the significant positive and negative occurrences, you know, that stand out in your memory from those times. And that'll kind of help put the past to rest, but it also might highlight for you what it is that you're nostalgic for. And then that can help you figure out what to aim for in the future. And so, you know, it sounds like you're rather hopeless about the present and by implication the future. And maybe that's because you don't have a richly enough developed conception of what it could be. So you could go back to your past and find out what it is that you wanted and had, and then you need to make a plan for how you might obtain that in the future. Now, it's a bit more complicated than that, because you talked about death, you know, and so you may be longing in some sense for a return to in a state of blissful ignorance where you weren't concerned about mortality. And, you know, the only real medication for that, I think that's real, is to live as worthwhile a life as you can, as full a life, so you don't have regrets. I'm not sure so much that people are afraid of death. They're maybe afraid of not living enough. And maybe if you lived enough, you could let it go when it was time. I think there's some truth in that. And so if you're overly afraid of death, it may be because you have a lot of unlived life in you. And you could go back to the past and you can find out what you needed and perhaps had then, and then you can strive to attain that in the present and the future.
And those exercises could, at least in principle, help you with that. So what are you missing, right? What are you missing that the past had for you? And maybe you write that down. Like, well, I had this, and it was really important to me. And I had a loving relationship with someone, and I don't have that now. I had the security of a comfortable home life, and I don't have that now. It's, well, those are things that now become ambitions, right? Because an ambition and a lack are mirror images of one another. And so if you can identify what you lack, you can derive an ambition from that. And you might say, well, that's impossible. It's like, well, you decompose it into small steps, and that's complicated, but so life is complicated. So there's no way around that. I'm 25. I had a drug problem when I was younger. In my late teens and early 20s, I stole money on multiple occasions. I don't even know who some of those people I stole from are and can't repay them. However, even in the instances where I could apologize or repay, I feel completely unable to. I'm too ashamed. This bothers me all the time. I can't sleep or do anything. I really hate myself. I think that I'm a rotten person and don't know how to handle it. Do you have any advice for this? Well, if I was your therapist, I would say, tell me about every single occasion that you remember where this happened. Now, you can't tell me because I'm not there, but you could write it down, and that would help. And maybe you could write down why you did it, and maybe you could do that with a bit of compassion. Obviously, your behavior was sufficiently reprehensible to be plaguing your conscience, but at least you have a conscience. That's something. And people make mistakes, especially when they're young, especially when they're addled by drug use, let's say. There's plenty of occasion there for misbehavior, that's for sure. And it's pretty common. In any case, you're plagued by this. So the past has still got its tentacles around you. Well, write it down. Write down every episode. Every time you worry about something like that, write it down and get a list. That's your symptoms. Then, the idea of approaching one of these people and apologizing and offering to repay them, that's a pretty good idea. Maybe you could list all the people that you stole from who you could do that with, and then rank order them in order of difficulty, and then think about how you would approach the least difficult of all those people and what you'd say. And maybe you have to write that out. Now, I'm not saying you have to do it, but you could do that to begin with, and then you could decide whether or not you could do it. And if you could do it with the easiest person, and then you could see how that goes. Maybe that actually helps. And then if you can't do that, maybe there's some other means of clearing your conscience. So when you write all this down, write down how much you took. And then maybe your goal could be you donate twice that amount to a charity. So you have to research charity and find one that you think is really valuable, where it would do some good. And so, you don't have to pay it all back at once, but maybe you could pay once a month or whatever. I don't know what your budget is. Maybe twice a month, maybe once every 3 months, whatever you could afford. And so then you've atoned for your sin, let's say, and you've transformed something bad that the people who experienced have probably already forgotten about. Unless you were stealing huge amounts of money and destroyed their lives, they've probably moved on. And so you could transform your nefarious actions into something that was good. Now, maybe a donation to charity, wouldn't do it for you. You could try it once and see if that helps, pay off one of your existential debts and see if that helps. It's a negotiation with yourself. And so then I guess I would also ask, are you more broadly depressed and anxious? You know what I mean? So are you fixating on this in a manner that's truly counterproductive, that's reflective of a deeper issue with depression or anxiety? And you'd know that, for example, if, well, you said you can't sleep or do anything, you really hate yourself, that's signs of generalization beyond the confines of these misdeeds. And so if that's the case, then perhaps even if you did atone for what you had done, other preoccupations with previous instances of unacceptable behavior would start to plague you to the same degree. That's a more complex problem, and if that's the case, then, well, your best bet then is to find a competent mental health professional and have your circumstance evaluated. And, if you're really torturing yourself to death about this, despite the fact that you've apparently ceased your drug abuse, well, maybe there's something else fueling it, and you may need to investigate that. So that's about all I can think of along those lines.
Let's say you're miserable and unhappy. Okay, here's a cure. Find what's valuable and let it go. So we could say, well, maybe it's a relationship that you have. Maybe it's a relationship with your parents, right? And the relationship is pathological, but you're locked into it, you value it, and no wonder, because it's a relationship with your parents. And you're suffering terribly because of it. Well, what do? Maybe you let it go. It's a sacrifice. And the idea is that, well, that'll clear the future for you. Well, very frequently when people are suffering terribly, not always, because sometimes you just suffer stupidly, blindly, and without recourse. You get cancer and then you die. So we have no idea how to deal with that. But sometimes the reason that you're suffering is because you just won't let go of the thing that's biting you. And you think, well, I can't let go of, and I've had clients like this, I can't stop communicating with my mother who phones me 3 times a day, every day of my life, and never says anything that isn't unbelievably critical and demeaning. I can't let that go. It's like, well, that's not such a good idea. The funny thing too, often when people let something like that go, it goes away, sorts itself out, and then comes back. So they don't even end up losing it. But unless they're willing to let it go, to sacrifice it, they make no headway whatsoever. And so one of the rules is, if people are impeding your development, you sacrifice your relationship with them, right? It's a very, very rough rule. So one of the things the existentialists would say is, what's the relationship between mental health and responsibility? And that's a good question, because it also has to do with something like the definition of mental health and responsibility. It's like, if you want your life to be well constituted, let's say, whatever that means, and it doesn't mean being happy. See, the reason it can't mean being happy is there's going to be times in your life where you're going to be called on to act when you're not happy. So for example, when one of your parents dies, you're going to make a choice. You're not going to be happy. That will not be, well, hopefully you won't be. Otherwise you're tangled in some sort of Freudian nightmare, but let's assume that that's not the case. You're not going to be happy about it. You're going to be hurt, and maybe even partly broken. So what the hell are you supposed to do then? Well, the answer is, you should be more use than trouble under such circumstances. And that's a good thing to strive for, because your mother's going to be, if it's your father, your mother's going to be equally distraught, and so are your siblings, and everyone else you care for. Maybe by that time you should be tough enough so that in that situation, you're good for something. Someone has to make the damn funeral arrangements. Someone has to settle out the will. Someone has to make sure the family doesn't degenerate into horrific squabbling, which is something that often happens after the death of a parent. And you're not going to be motivated to do that by happiness. And what if you have a sick child when you're a parent? Maybe it's a chronic illness. You are not going to be happy about that. It'll be a weight that you carry with you all the time. And it's one of those things that seems particularly unjust. It's like, okay, well, you're no longer happy. Well, if being happy is the purpose of life, well, then that's pretty much it for you, isn't it? And these catastrophes that I'm speaking of, you can be certain that you're going to be exposed to many of those during your life. You know, it'll be a rare period. I think it's a rare period in anyone's life where one or more of such things isn't going on chronically. If it's not you with some terrible health problem or some other terrible problem, then it's a parent or a sibling or a child, or because you know you're connected to other people and they're vulnerable too. So that's the lot of human beings. And so if it's happiness, and this is what Solzhenitsyn said about happiness too, he said, happiness is a philosophy who's brought to ruin by the first blow of a guard's truncheon. It's like, yeah, that's about as bluntly as you can put it. Dostoevsky's critique basically said, you can't solve the problem of suffering by formalizing a utopia and joining it like a mass animal. You can't do that because you're not that kind of creature. Even if it was possible, you wouldn't accept it. You'd cause trouble because you're interested in trouble. You're probably more interested in trouble than you are in being happy. Kierkegaard says something similar, but in a more what would you say? In a manner that's more constructive in some sense with regards to what you should do with all that insane energy that you're not going to be able to encapsulate inside a utopia. And it has to do with individual responsibility. I think at least part of it is the complexity of our society. It isn't certain how the future is going to lay itself out, and it isn't certain that what you knew in the past is going to be sufficient for you to move forward into the future. So there's lots of opportunity, but it's very complex. And it's not easy to keep up in our world. You know, like if you look around the world, you might think, well, the happiest people are those where the standard of living is the highest. That's actually not the case.
Right.
And you think, okay, but why wouldn't that be the case? It's like, what do you want? Malaria and death at 40? Obviously not. But then you think, okay, what's the price you pay for a high standard of living? Well, that's easy. You virtually always sacrifice the present for the future. You're always working. I mean, you guys, you're fairly influential and you've got this good thing going, but like, it could crash at a moment's notice. You better keep your eye on it. And every day you're thinking, okay, this has to be done, and this has to be done, and this has to be done. And it pays off. I mean, you have a nice studio and I would presume a reasonably comfortable life, but it's not like you're not running on a treadmill to keep that going. And so that's security and it's health, but it isn't necessarily happiness, and it's certainly not necessarily freedom from anxiety. Sure. And I would say most people in the modern world, weirdly enough, have far too much to do. You know, 2 career families and a couple of kids. It's like, man, you're done. That's 60 hours a week of flat out work. Yep. So, and that can be too much. And then I also think, because our society is philosophically unstable, and that's sort of reflected in this polarization, is that people are doubtful about whether their lives have any meaning, for example. You know, well, why bother? What's the use of it? Who cares? It's like, what difference is it going to make in a million years, you know? And life is hard, and if you just have a nihilistic viewpoint, then it's easy to be swamped by doubts and existential angst and all of that. And like, I think that's a mistake, because I think that your life can be very meaningful. It's proportionate to the responsibility that you take on. And you can learn that by watching when you're engaged in the world, you know, and what works to sort of protect you from feelings of isolation and doom. You know, and a lot of the lectures I have on YouTube are about exactly that. Positive emotion is associated with movement forward. Like, if you're where you want to be and things are going well, then your behavior should be activated so that you go and get things. Now, one of the negative consequences of that is that if you're really in a good mood, really happy, you're going to be impulsive and make mistakes. You know, because you hear these dough-headed, that's a very minor word, people who are always pushing happiness as the key measure for successful existence. It's so ill-informed that it's embarrassing that even happens. Positive emotion makes people impulsive. Maniacs, for example, which is really, that's mania, right? Bipolar disorder. If you're manic, you're one happy person. way too happy. Everything is great. Nothing but wonderful things that are beyond your imagination are going to happen to you, and they're going to happen fast. And so you're down to the mall to buy everything you can possibly get your hands on because you have 100 uses for everything. And then a week later, you crash into your depressive episode and you realize that you're $150,000 in debt and you've alienated everyone that you know. It's like, that's untrammeled positive emotion. So how about no? A pure index of positive emotion is no way of determining whether or not a system is working properly, even your own system. You need a balance between positive and negative emotions. Plus, positive emotions are absolutely exhausting, because if you're in a manic episode, it's like, it's time to get everything good right now. Fine, but you won't sleep for a week and then you die because you just burned yourself to a crisp. And so to be overwhelmingly enthusiastic about everything sounds like a real blast, and I've seen full-blown manics and they're having plenty of fun, but it is not a pleasant thing to behold. They're just all over the place. And yeah, it's really not good. It's really not good. You need a balance between these two systems, because the whole world isn't explored territory bursting with nothing but promise. That's not the world. The world is that, in a bounded space, a little bit, with an absolute horror show going out around the periphery. And both systems need to be active in order to keep you balanced. People do, unfortunately, sustain damage sometimes to the left prefrontal cortex, responsible for positive emotion, or the right prefrontal cortex, responsible for negative emotion. And if you sustain right hemisphere prefrontal damage, it makes you inappropriately happy and impulsive, and your life just goes, you just spiral downhill, because you make nothing but impulsive decisions. And you know what the real world consequence of that is? Get drunk and be impulsive for one night, you can learn what the bloody consequences of that are. So usually, often, people pursue local pleasure because that's the best they can imagine. It's the best they've been taught. They don't see another alternative. So it can be ignorance. It can be they don't want to adopt the responsibility, because part of the problem with working at every level of the hierarchy simultaneously is that it's like dancing to a very complex waltz, let's say. You have to be paying attention to a very large number of things simultaneously and doing things right. It requires responsibility. And so, it's a pain. It's a weight. Part of the reason people drink alcohol is to get rid of their responsibility. I mean, that's, you hear people drink because they have problems. It's like, yeah, no. Some people drink because they're anxious, and alcoholics drink because they're in withdrawal. But young people drink because they're sick and tired of being responsible, because it's annoying. It's like, so I'll drink enough, I won't care about the medium to long-term consequences, because alcohol, that's exactly what alcohol does. It doesn't make you ignorant of the medium to long-term consequences, but it makes you not care about them. And partly it's because it dampens anxiety. So it dampens anxiety, leaves your positive emotion circuits intact, so then you can go out there and do stupid fun things, and that's a party, really. Let's go do stupid fun things. That's a party. But the medium to long-term consequences it's risky. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but it's risky. So, yeah, they don't know better. That's the answer, I would say.
If you're plagued by bouts of depression and anxiety, that does destabilize your identity. So it's almost by definition. But having said that, look, this is when habit and plan and strategy are so useful. So in the periods of depression that I've had, and some of them were long and certainly the most unpleasant experiences of my life, this is when you need a philosophy, let's say, that's allied with your vision and your strategy to sustain you. Because what would happen to me is that, I have a vision, and I suppose the vision is of a world that's better, that's less likely to descend into ideological catastrophe, and where people are more responsible and more awake and more educated and
and healthier. All of that, a vision of a better world, you know, a world that's less hellish at least, but also a better world, and some sense of what role I might play in that. And so that's very motivating. Like, it's a profound goal to try to make things better. And you can do that locally. You can do that for yourself. You can do that for your family. You can do that for the broader community. And all of that's worth it, man. It's worth making some sacrifices for. It's worth suffering for to some degree. And then you decompose that into the day-to-day and week-to-week strategies and actions that you're undertaking, the plans and the activities that you're putting forward to make that dream a reality, to realize it. And then when the depression and anxiety come along, you think, part of it with depression, it's like, it's just bloody endurance. It's like, you get up and you work through the next hour, you try to stay on track, you try to implement your strategic plans to the best of your ability, and you hope and you pray that you'll get through it. You know, you'll get through it, and that the darkness will recede, and you stay on track. You eat even though you're not hungry. You get up even though you want to stay in bed. You interact with people even though you'd rather be alone. And it's the benefit of disciplined habits can sustain you. It's like the boat you're rowing in through a terrible storm, leaks and all, and maybe you'll be overwhelmed, but you have the boat and you can row forward, and that's what you've got. And so endurance is a huge part of it. And then I would say with its anxiety, it's the same thing. It's like, or very much the same, as you're terrified and uncertain, but you move ahead to the best of your ability. And again, you operate at least to some degree on hope. And if you haven't got hope, then you've got blind, bloody endurance. And that's all motivated by some sense that you're working towards something that's worthwhile working toward, you know, and that is, well, that's your own long-term well-being, to treat yourself properly. It's the stability and productivity and harmony and health of your family. That's a huge deal. And then it's whatever benefit you can be to the community. And if you have to limp along and drag yourself forward in order to maintain that pathway, then so be it, because it's better than the alternative.
You need an ideal because you have nothing to aim at, but an ideal is a judge, and you always fall short of the ideal. So how the hell can you have the benefits of having an ideal without having the crushing blow that goes along with having the judge that always regards you as insufficient? So I was trying to work that out in the chapter, and this is something I've had to work out a lot as a clinical psychologist. It's like, well, let's say you need a goal, but we don't want to let your distance from the goal crush you. So you got to set up a goal, and then you got to make the goal, break the goal down into parts so that you can move towards it and you have a fairly high likelihood of doing it. So that's a bit of practical, I wouldn't say advice, it's because it's better than advice. It's some practical knowledge about how to go about achieving an aim. Set a high aim, but differentiate it down so you know what the next step is, and then make the next step difficult enough so you have to push yourself past where you are, but also provide yourself with a reasonable probability of success. It's also what you do with children, right? You want to push them because they need to grow up and be more than they are, right? But you don't want to crush them with constant failure. So what you do is aim high and make the goal difficult but proximal.
I think a tremendous amount of what you might regard as shadow integration, which in the parlance of behavioral psychologists would be something like assertiveness training, right? It's training in how to stand up for yourself and for your, let's say, for your better self, which would be the self that you could use productively over a medium to long period of time that would be of use to you, but also of use to people around you. So it's a self that's bounded by the necessity of taking care of yourself, but also simultaneously taking care of the people around you. I think that the simplest way to start that work is to consult your resentment. You know, it's easy to become bitter about life and to become angry because, of course, life is difficult and it's full of disappointments, and people are also subject to betrayal on the part of themselves and on the part of people that hypothetically care for them. And so it's easy to get bitter. and to be resentful. And resentment is a very useful emotion, even though I think it's one of the most damaging emotions if it's not dealt with properly. So if you're resentful, it basically means only one of two things. It either means you should grow up and quit whining and get on with your life, or it means that you're being subject to tyrannical forces of one form or another, maybe emanating from you, maybe a consequence of the natural environment, maybe a consequence of society. You're being subject to tyrannical forces, and you're not putting your own best interests forward, like in that broader sense that I described. And I don't mean your selfish, narrow interests that only serve the purposes of instantaneous gratification. I mean your own best interests in terms of developing your character over the span of your life. If you're resentful, it either means that you're immature and that you should grow the hell up. And so you need to figure out how much of your resentment is that, and maybe allied with the desire to find other things or people to blame. But the other possible option is that you have something to say or do, right? Because you're in a situation where you're violating your own internal ethical standards, and you're being required, pressured, let's say things you don't believe or to do things that you believe to be wrong. And you need to determine, you need to start to strategize and plan how you can rectify that so that you can say what you mean. Like if you're negotiating with a marital partner, for example, and there are issues in your marriage that aren't making you happy, well, the first thing is you have to take note of that, right? To see that you're actually unhappy. The second is that you have to be willing to engage in a certain amount of conflict, because in order to sort out what's disturbing you, you're going to have to lay your concerns out on the table and say, well, look, this is bothering me. You don't have to say, well, I'm right and you're wrong and you have to fix this. You have to say, well, I've noticed that this pattern of interaction or lack of interaction, say, in our relationship is making me resentful and angry. And the danger of that, of course, is you're going to take it out on yourself and your partner. The danger is passive aggressiveness. You know, you're not going to respond to your partner positively when they do something good if you're resentful about them. And you're not going to respond to yourself properly. And so you have to lay it out on the table, but sort of in a spirit of ignorant humility. It's like, look, I'm frustrated. I'm feeling this way about our relationship. Here's what I think might be going wrong, maybe on my part and maybe on your part. And here's what I envision as a possible solution. That's also really necessary if you're going to say what you have to say, which is to manifest yourself properly in the world. Is you can't just complain about what's wrong. You have to think, well, what would my minimal preconditions for satisfaction be? One of the things I've thought about a fair bit is the meaning of the Sermon on the Mount. And as far as I can tell, it's basically two-part wisdom. The first is that you should aim at the highest good that you can imagine. And that would be a good that includes everyone, right? So if I wanted what was good for you, say, if I genuinely wanted it, I'd want it in a way that was good for you now and good in the long run and good for you and your family and your community and maybe good for me too. You know, you could conceive of that as the desire. And I think that's a good definition of love, is that you actually want the best possible outcome. And in the Gospels, of course, that's extended even to your enemies.
Yes.
Right? Is that, okay, if we're going to have things good, let's have it good enough for even the people that set themselves up against me. Because if the world was running properly, things would be good for them too. And that would be better. And it seems to me that that's a very good way of looking at things. It's a difficult way of looking at things. And then the second part of the Sermon on the Mount is something like, having established that as your aim, which is no easy thing, by the way, right? Because you have to be pretty clear-headed and single-minded to actually want that to be your aim. Then you can concentrate on the day and you can try telling the truth. And you can ally, so there's truth and love that are allied together. Truth, love, and attention, it's something like that are all allied together.
Treat yourself like you're someone that you care about. See, I read this piece of work by Youre a long while back, and it was a meditation on the injunction to treat your neighbor as you would like to be treated, something like that. And what Jung pointed out, which I really liked, was that that wasn't an injunction to be nice to other people. It was an invitation to reciprocity. It was something like this. It's like, you should figure out how you would like to be treated, like you were taking care of yourself, not how you would like people to respond to you. It's more important than that. It's like, imagine you had a child that you really cared for, and someone said, well, people will treat this child exactly like you want them to, but you have to figure out what that is. And so then you'd have to sit down for like a month and you'd think, okay, well, how do you want your child to be treated? You don't want everyone just to be nice to him, you know, you want people to challenge him, and you want people to discipline him, and you want people to tell him when he's wrong. It's like, you don't just want everyone to be nice. That's pathetic. It's pathetic. There's no challenge in that. And so, well, you want to treat other people like you would like to be treated. Well, then you have to figure out, how would you like to be treated? And while you'd like people to fawn all over you and just lay everything at your feet, it's like, no, that's not something you'd wish for someone that you were taking care of. And then there's an additional problem, which is, it's often the case that people will treat other people better than they treat themselves. That happens extremely frequently. So one of the things I pointed out in chapter 2 was that if you have a dog and you take him to a vet and the vet gives you the prescription medicine, you'll go buy the medicine and you will give it to the dog and you will do it properly. But if you go yourself to a doctor and you get a prescription, there's a 30% chance you won't even pick up the medication. And if you do, there's a 50% chance that you won't administer it to yourself properly. And so I really thought about that. When I first came across that statistic, it was another one of those little facts. I thought, what's up with that? It's like, you'll do it for your dog, so obviously you'll do it for something you care about, and you're conscientious enough so you'll actually do it. So like, why wouldn't you do it for you? Your dog likes you, you know, even your dog would rather that you did, but you don't. And it's actually one of the reasons that modern medicine doesn't work nearly as well as it could, because people just don't take their medication. You make the world a much better place, much worse place, if you don't take care of yourself. So you should bloody well take care of yourself, you know, because, well, that's what the chapter's about. It's partly because you have something valuable to bring into the world. That's the thing about being an individual. It's the thing that Western civilization has always recognized, that as an individual, you have a light that you have to bring into the world, and that if you don't bring it into the world is a dimmer place. And that's a bad thing, because when the world is a dim place, it can get very, very, very dark. And so it's necessary, not just so that you feel better, not just so that you're a #1 lobster, none of those things. You need to take care of yourself because you're in the best position to do that. And it's necessary for you to take care of yourself. Despite the fact that we're mortal and vulnerable and self-conscious and capable, not only capable of doing terrible things, but actually do them. Despite all that, you still have that responsibility. Compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today. And the reason I wrote that was because I had this client, I'm a clinical psychologist, and I've spent 20 hours a week for 25 years listening to people tell me about their lives, you know, and those people were people who were just barely hanging on to the bottom of the world, up to people who were so successful you can hardly believe it, like the entire gamut of people. And that's been absolutely fascinating. It's like being a clinical psychologist, if you really listen, is like being immersed in a Dostoevsky novel all the time, you know, because it's amazing what people will tell you if you listen to them. People are so interesting if you actually listen to them, because they're so peculiar. Like, they're like penguins or rhinoceroses or ostriches. They're unlikely creatures. And anyways, with regards to comparing yourself to who you were yesterday and not to who someone else is today, this old client of mine, he was about 85 when he came to see me, and he was a financier and a kind of a mathematical genius. He made these little pendants out of a mathematical symbol for the most beautiful mathematical equation that was ever written. He made them out of gold, and he would hand those out. And he had studied psychology as a young man, and he introduced me to this concept that I didn't know about, called the Pareto distribution, which, see, I'd been taught as a psychologist that most human characteristics were normally distributed, right? So most people were average and some people were extreme. That's a Pareto or a normal distribution. Intelligence is like that, and height, there's more people of average height than very tall or very short, and weight is like that, and lots of things are normally distributed, and psychologists tend to assume that everything is, but it isn't. Creative products are distributed in a Pareto distribution, and that's a whole different thing, and it's really important to know this. It's another fundamental fact, the knowledge of which can sort of transform the way you conceptualize, let's say, the political landscape. So here's an example of the Pareto distribution. You know, there's a rule of thumb that if you run a company that 20% of your employees do 80% of the work, or that 20% of your customers are responsible for 80% of your sales, or that 20% of them are responsible for 80% of the customer service calls. Same thing, but that's not exactly the rule. The rule is worse than that. The rule is, in a given domain, the square root of the number of people operating in that domain do half the productive work. So you think, well, you have 10 employees, 3 of them do half the work. It's like, yeah, okay. What if you have 100 employees? Then 10 of them do half the work. What if you have 1,000 employees? Well, then it's 30. And if it's 10,000 employees, then it's 100. And this actually turns out to be a rather ironclad rule. It applies across very, very many situations. It applies, for example, to the mass of stars and the size of cities. So you can see how universal it is as a law, and it's something like those that have more get more, and those that have less get less. That's the Matthew principle, right? To those who have everything, more will be given. From those who have nothing, everything will be taken away. And the economists sometimes call that the Matthew principle. And so what that lays out is a world that's rife with inequality. So, you know, you hear this idea that I think it's the 85 richest people in the world have more money than the bottom 2 billion. That's a Pareto distribution phenomena. And you might say, to hell with capitalism for producing that. It's like, sorry, you got your diagnosis wrong. It's a natural law. It's no matter what society you study, you get a Pareto distribution of wealth. You get a Pareto distribution of number of records recorded. You get a Pareto distribution of number of songs written or goals scored. Like any creative product has that characteristic. And it's partly because as you start to become successful, let's say, people offer you more and more opportunities. And as you start to fail, people move away from you and you plummet. And so, okay, so that's rough. So what it means is that there is always a landscape of inequality. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't do anything about it, although I am saying that we don't know what to do about it. That's the thing, you know, because you can modify the Pareto distribution of wealth, let's say, but we don't know how to do it without maybe disrupting the system so completely that it collapses, which is what happened in the Soviet Union, for example, and in Maoist China. They were trying, at least in principle, to adjust inequality. But the cure was far worse than the disease. And the truth of the matter is, we actually don't know technically how much inequality there has to be to generate wealth. We can guess, and you could say, well, there should be less, and you might say, well, there should be more. If you're left-wing, you'd say less, and if you're right-wing, you'd say, well, we'll just let the inequality flourish. But we do know that it's inevitable, and we also know that we don't know how to regulate it. So, there is inequality. What that means is there's always going to be people around that are better at something than you are. And that's a problem, because you can get jealous and you can get bitter and you can get resentful, and worse, you can get hopeless, you know, because you look like I have this friend of mine. He told me something so funny. He was decrying his lack of success in the world, and he compared himself to his roommate. And he said, you know, his college roommate was doing much better than he was. And his bloody roommate was Elon Musk. It's like, really? Like, it's like, oh, you're not doing as well as Elon Musk. Well, I mean, you can see it would take it rather personally because they were roommates and everything. It wasn't like he was doing badly. Like, he was doing pretty damn well. It's like, I'm not as good as Elon Musk. It's like, yeah, well, you and like 7 billion other people, you know. But I thought it was instructive because you have to be careful who you compare yourself to. Now, you can't just not compare yourself to successful people, right? Because then you don't have anything to aim at.
One of the fundamental theses of 12 Rules for Life and also of Maps of Meaning is that because life is essentially tragic in its fundamental essence, you need a sustaining meaning that's deep and profound, and deep and profound enough to get you through bad times, because there will be very bad times in your life. There'll be death and there'll be illness, and There'll be disappointment of all sorts. And there'll be just the standard difficulties of life in the world to contend with. And you really must have something that's profound and powerful to set up against that. And I think that your voluntary adoption of the struggle to improve being is the proper antidote to that.